Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com, and today we're continuing our coverage of the 1972 World Chess Championship between Bobby Fischer and Boris Spassky. Up until this point, games 1 through 10 has pretty been one-sided. Boris Spassky did come out strong with the victory in the first game. Bobby Fischer forfeited the second game, and then since then, Bobby Fischer's been on a roll. And after 10 games, Bobby Fischer has a 3-point advantage, 6.5 points for Bobby Fischer, but Spassky has 3.5 points. So going into game number 11, Bobby Fischer looking to pretty much put a nail in the coffin, but Spassky looking to come back and try to have a go at this title. So Spassky is going to have the white pieces here, and starts out with pawn to e4. And if you remember some of our earlier series, pawn to e4 is not very common for Spassky. That's very common for Bobby Fischer, but Spassky did not play a lot of e4. We see Bobby Fischer respond pawn to c5, the Sicilian, so very similar to what we saw in Game 7. And in Game 7, we actually saw the poison pawn variation, and Bobby Fischer would go on to have a 2-pawn advantage but not be able to have a win, so they did draw that. And we see a very similar opening from both players, knight to f3, pawn to d6, a knight up here to d4. After knight to d4, knight f6, and then we get into the Najdorf, so pawn to a6. Very sharp line, stops any of these knights or the bishop coming here to b5. So very aggressive opening that you'll see a lot from the Sicilian players. Bishop over here to g5, getting the dark square bishop involved into the game. Pawn to e6, pawn up here to f4, and then queen down here to b6. This is the poison pawn variation in the Najdorf defense. You can always go back and watch Game 7 if you want to see how they played that game, or there's another video I created on the poison pawn if you just want to learn more about that specific variation. But play continued with queen to d2, and you don't have to play queen to d2 if you wanted to. You could always play knight to b3 and just not even allow your opponent to come down here on b2. But Spassky decided, okay, I'm going to go ahead and play queen to d2. Must have something up his sleeve, knowing that his opponent, Bobby Fischer, has never in the history of chess lost playing the black pieces in the Najdorf poison pawn. So pretty risky, I think, but decides that he has to be pretty risky knowing that he is down 3 points in this match. So after queen to d2, we see queen takes on b2. And black doesn't always have to take this poison pawn here on b2. He has some other options. He could just continue with regular play, knight here to c6. That's really his best option. It's not going to be good if he tries something, bishop to e7, may seem somewhat intuitive, getting ready to castle on the king's side, then start to really put pressure on the queen side where he has his queen. Some of his other pieces he get involved into the action because of pawn to e5. This kind of just blows up the center of the board. After the pawn takes, pawn recaptures. The knight's going to come over here to d5 since it is being attacked, and this kind of opens up the door for, after an exchange, the king is going to have to come take here on e7. He's kind of misplaced here, not exactly what black wants to be doing. Queen here to g5. So all in all, not really the best move to play a bishop to e7, but if you want to, you could have played just knight to c6. Instead, Bobby Fischer, being really good at the poison pawn variation as black, decides to go ahead and come down here to queen to b2, and then knight to b3. And Spassky even had a couple options here. Rook to b1 is probably a safer play. He's going to gain some tempo as far as getting development. Queen here to a3. His queen's not doing too much. He does give up a pawn of material, but this rook here on b1 controls the semi-open file. And if you look on board, he has way more material into the middle of the board, really attacking his opponent. So usually white can make up for that pawn material that he decided to give up. But instead decided to play knight to b3. And this is kind of more the trapping lines where you try to put your opponent in some really tough situations and hope that you can trap their queen eventually and then end up with an easy victory. Bobby Fischer continues with queen to a3, making sure his queen is in a safe position, and then bishop takes here on f6. If you look back at game number 7, this is the first difference in the game where Boris Spassky actually played bishop to d3. He decided afterwards that wasn't the best variation in this particular game. it really kind of blocked off his queen from attacking this d file, and he wants to make sure his light square bishop is either on e2 or d3 so he can castle on the king side, get some protection, and then allow his other rook here to really roam free and start to attack his opponent. But decided the bishop here on d3, not the best square. Instead, decided first to go ahead and take here on f6, really take away the only minor piece that is on the board that's not on the back rank here. And that's the knight here on f6. So decides to go ahead and take here. Now there's double pawns here on the f file. So all in all, I think a pretty good variation change that Buddy Spassky has. Now he plays bishop here to e2, opening up, keeping the door for this queen to attack on the d file. So if you kind of look at it, you can see white is down that pawn of material. But all of a sudden, black, if he castles on the king side, it's not going to be as safe, so he's usually going to keep his king in the center of the board. He's not going to castle on the queen side because you have the c file that's open right here. And all of a sudden, white has a very strong attack. He has both of his knights kind of in the center of the board. He has a queen all ready to go. He can castle very easily. So this is a pretty good position for Buddy Spassky. We do see the pawn come over here to h5. He could, if he wanted to, get his queen out of trouble. He could play queen to b4. And then after castle, he could queen up here to b6. Check. Very easy for the king just to come here to h1. But if you look at this, right away, Bobby Fischer, he's just moving his queen around. He's not really doing too much, but Buddy Spassky's doing exactly what he wants to. He's continuing with his plan, castle, get his king over to a safe square. So this doesn't really help Bobby Fischer as much as he wants to. Decides to go ahead and put a little pressure on his opponent with pawn to h5. Since he's not going to castle on the king side, he says, let's go ahead and start to push my pawn over here, see if I can blow these pawns up, start to put pressure since I know my opponent's not going to be castling on the queen side of the board. So now we see castle on the king side. A knight here to c6 needs to get some material involved into the game. A king here to h1. Not really sure. I really like king to h1 here. The king is not under any pressure. Could have started to attack the queen if he wanted to, but decides first to play king to h1. Bishop to d7, and the knight to b1. If you kind of read lots of commentary or if you've studied this game before, knight to b1 was thought to be very, very novel. We hadn't really seen this move in the poison pawn variation up until this point, and I think it really caught Bobby Fischer by surprise, him being the expert in this opening. When he kind of talked about it, it didn't really seem like he had studied this because it's such an odd move. You kind of bring your knight back to b1, blocks off the rook here on a1. It does attack the queen, but it seems like he should be able to get free. So he decides to first come here to queen to b4, attacking the queen, queen to e3. Does not want to trade off queens, but does want to block off some of the other squares that the queen can go to, specifically this square here on b6. Bobby Fischer now tries to open up the door for the queen to go back on the dark squares, playing pawn to d5. Buddy Spassky takes that right away because the pawn can't recapture. It's being pinned down by this queen right here that would take the king. Not a legal move. So the knight comes back, getting ready to take the pawn right here. Then pawn up here to c4, just adding more pressure in the center of the board, exactly what Buddy Spassky wants to do. And then knight to f6. We could have seen queen to d6, but then knight to c3. Knight down here f5, queen over here to d3. I think white definitely has a better position on board, starting to blow up the pawn chain in the center of the board. The king here on h1 is very well protected, but it's kind of tough to figure out exactly what the best move is. But knight to f5 seems okay, but we still don't see a lot of Bobby Fischer's pieces working together, and he's going to be facing a lot of pressure, one from his queen over here that's starting to get trapped a little bit, and the king in the center of the board. Queen here to d3, a pawn over here to h4, starting to push a little bit on the king side, bishop to g4, and then knight over here to d6, attacking the backward pawn here on c4. But that's fine with Buddy Spassky. He actually wants to get his knight involved here to d2. So this just gives him a reason. Come here to d2, protect this backward pawn here on c4, and then pawn f5. So attacking the bishop, and this is kind of a defining moment because Buddy Spassky's up until this point been putting all of his pieces in a spot where he can really put pressure on Bobby Fischer's queen. And so from here on out, he's not even going to really be caring about too much else. He says, yeah, I don't care that my bishop's here on g4 and you can attack it. I'm going to play pawn to a3. Okay, well, the queen's going to have to come back. Queen here to b6. If it wanted to, you could also come to queen to a4. Queen to a5, it just loses to the knight that's here on b3. But this gets pretty tricky. Knight up here to c5. checking the queen, if you will. The queen's going to come back to a5, and then comes up here to d7. We do see the king capture, and then after some exchange on board, it gets pretty tricky. Knight here to b3, pawn up here. We do see the pawn take on g4, and after this pawn, the bishop takes. Then all of a sudden, the rook's going to be able to come here to d1. They're going to be able to double up, and this bishop is going to fall. So this is going to be a pretty good variation for white. So Bobby Fischer, although he's in a tough spot, I think he chose correctly with just bringing the queen back here to b6. But pawn up here to c5 says, yeah, you can move your queen back here to a7 if you want to, but then I'm just going to take your knight, and that's completely fine with me. Decides can't do that. Queen down here to b5, does not want to trade off these queens right now, so queen over here to c3. And then we see a knight, or first the pawn takes on a g4. And we could see a few things from Spassky. He could, if he wanted to, take with his queen up here on h8. That could be good, but unfortunately the queen is just over here by himself, and that's really not the plan. His plan is to attack this queen right here. If play continues, knight here to f5, rook over here to c1, pawn to h3, really putting pressure on his opponent. After the pawn takes, the knight comes down here. You can see there's just too much pressure that Bobby Fischer can put on his opponent. Just don't even want to have to deal with it. If instead you could see the pawn takes here on d6, well, this is just as bad because rook down here to h6, knight up here to c5, but then you could actually see the queen just come back here to d7. That's going to be fine for Bobby Fischer. Instead decides after the pawn takes on a g4, just say pawn to a4, putting more pressure on his opponent. Now his queen can't really come back to a7 because it's stuck right here, so he doesn't really have any good moves. So he decides to push a little bit on the king side, says, if I can't do anything, I'm just going to try my best to one last-ditch effort to go ahead and try to attack you. Okay, Bobby Fischer loses his queen here on b5. Pawn here to g2. The king takes right here. Rook down here to h3, attacking the queen, so very important that Spassky does not make a mistake and plays a queen to f6. Be a disaster if he plays pawn to d6 and then allows his queens to fall. And then all of a sudden, if we see some exchanges on board, his opponent's going to have a much better setup. Bobby Fischer has double bishop pawn or double bishops, open board state. He has more pawns on board. This is going to be, I think, easy victory for Bobby Fischer. So as we come back, decides, okay, let's not do anything too crazy, but Spassky, queen here to f6, and then knight down here to f5, pawn up here. Really, really strong attack, just putting too much pressure on his opponent. Queen back, or bishop to c8. Pawn takes on e6, blowing up the center of the board. And then rook over here to e1. Bishop to e7, and then rook up here to e6, and says, yeah, I can double barrel, bring my rook over here to e1, just put too much pressure on you. If the bishop comes here, he can bring his queen here, the bishop can't move. He can easily take the knight right after that, unless he wants to allow the rook to come over here. His rook can't even do too much on board. He would just die to one of these other pieces on board. So all in all, Spassky just kind of dominated his opponent, and this was the first time that Bobby Fischer had lost with the poison pawn playing as the black pieces in the Najdorf defense. So Spassky does cut the deficit to 2 points going into game 12. Bobby Fischer cannot be excited with this, so he's going to be looking to come back with the white pieces and really make sure that his opponent knows that he is for real and he's coming to take this title. But hopefully everyone enjoyed game 11, one of the more exciting games. If you ever study the poison pawn, people usually point to this game. So it's a good one to always go back and refresh about. It is very exciting. And if you haven't played the poison pawn, definitely recommend it. Najdorf defense and the Sicilian. Thanks for watching again, and I'll see y'all in game number 12.